I'm just going to spend zero time on me, but I want you to at least have the context of why the business model canvas is something that's important to me. I teach entrepreneurship here at Tepper. I'm also an entrepreneur in residence with the Swartz Center. I've done a number of startups. My most noteworthy one is a company called MedSage Technologies, which we sold to Philips back in 2010, and I'm currently working on my fourth startup called sovasage.com, which you're welcome to check out our website. I was also what's called a Vistage Chair at one point, which is an advisory group for CEOs where CEOs of small companies come together and help each other through strategic issues. The reason that's relevant for today's discussion is that the business model canvas was a tool that I used to great extent with those CEOs in helping them map out a strategy for new business lines, new companies, new products. So it is a tool that can be used in a lot of different ways. I talk more about my entrepreneurial endeavors because that's what's near and dear to my heart, but I have done the corporate thing too. I spent some time at UPMC Enterprises, and I ran the new venture group at Respironics for a number of years. That's relevant for this discussion because big corporations tend to use this tool in a slightly different way. And we'll talk a little bit about how you use this in a startup as compared to how most big companies use this tool, if they use it at all. So that's just kind of a contextual background for me. As far as this discussion goes and how I like to operate, please do not hesitate if you have a question to unmute yourself and interrupt me. You know, I'm looking at my screen that has my slides, and I have these little pictures over here of myself and the rest of you, but I don't see chat while I'm doing this, and I may or may not see your hand raised. So don't be shy. Just unmute and interrupt me if you have a question. So with that, let me get started. I want to talk today about the business model canvas. And you know, I like to start out by saying that this is a tool that is more than just a box to check. And the reason I say that is because this tool is used incorrectly, dare I say, most of the time. So what I'm going to teach you today is not just what is this tool, but how do you use it in a practical way. And I'm going to give you some tips, some very specific tips on how best to do that. So let's get started with a question. Carnegie Mellon, lots of brilliant engineers, right? I myself am a mechanical engineer in my undergraduate, so I think I can speak and not offend people when I say that most engineers start with this concept of it's all about the product, right? Build a better mousetrap and the world will beat a path to your door, right? That old saying. So why waste our time modeling out a business? Just make the best product and people will come to us. Has anybody ever said that to themselves or had somebody say that to you? Well, I'm going to answer the question as to why it is important, because business models are extremely important. And we're going to go through a couple examples. So hopefully many of you are familiar with a company called Rosetta Stone. Rosetta Stone was and is a very innovative company. So they were founded in 1992, and you know, for many years, they were the leader in digital language learning. So they revolutionized how you would learn a second language. And they did it through a software product, which was unique. You know, you could go to school and learn French, but Rosetta gave you a way to learn and self-teach yourself. One of the things that they were really innovative with was their sales channels. Had nothing to do with their product, right? So their products were sold, and you can see them in the boxes here on a disc, and you'd pop it into your computer and away you'd go. It was not web-based, and generally you bought these in airports, right? This is a kiosk in an airport, and they used to be in every airport in the country. And by the way, every one of those boxes was expensive. It would cost up to $500 almost to buy one of these. I bought one of these once for a trip I was planning to go to Paris. They weren't cheap, but they were very effective and they were very innovative. And they were the leader until something happened. Can anybody guess what happened? It's CMU. I guarantee you some of you know.
Oh, the internet.
Duolingo.
Yeah, Duolingo came into being, right? And Luis von Ahn introduced Duolingo back in 2011. So how is it different? Well, number one, it was mobile-based, right? It operated right on your smartphone. It was web-based. You didn't have to buy a piece of software and download it. In fact, you didn't need your PC at all. But those were just the beginning. And those were pretty product-related differentiators. But beyond that, the business model side of it was tremendously different because they practiced a freemium pricing model, and a freemium pricing model means that to get in and start using the product didn't cost you a thing. You could download the app for free. You could begin using it. You could even, it was somewhat gamified in that if you did certain things, you could actually extend the use of the product without paying for it. But at some point, if you really were serious about learning the language quickly, then you'd start paying a subscription fee. And it was not $500, right? It was $9.99, sometimes even less, right? So there was an upscale where you started to pay for something. And of course, that was a big part of their success. I mean, they just this last year did a funding at $1 billion valuation. So they are officially Pittsburgh's first unicorn, and something that the Pittsburgh community and Carnegie Mellon in particular and Luis should obviously be very proud of. But most of the changes there were business model changes, right? Some of them enabled by technology changes, but a lot of them just looking at the business differently. So you start with Rosetta Stone. They revolutionized the language business, and then Duolingo comes in and basically obsoletes Rosetta Stone, right? It obsoletes their business model and requires that they change it. So business models are important. Another example is Luis's earlier company, which is called reCAPTCHA. So has anybody ever used reCAPTCHA on this call? I guarantee you all have, right? Whether you realize it or not. reCAPTCHA is essentially the tool. It's now owned by Google that allows you to identify yourself as a human being rather than a robot, right? Luis introduced that in 2007. And it does two different things. It either asks you to type in these crazy little sideways, sometimes pixelated words, or more recently, you're actually going in and saying, tell me the pictures that have fire hydrants or stoplights or a truck, right? And you're essentially training algorithms for Google when you're doing that, right? The technology is not really what made that idea such a great idea. What made it a great idea was that they found a business model where they could find a third-party value proposition. In the case of the words, you were essentially transcribing old copies of the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, and that third party was paying for it. The e-commerce provider was not paying for it. You're obviously, as a consumer, not paying for it, but you are creating value for a third party by essentially being a free source of labor, right? And that was sold to Google prior to Duolingo for a paltry $28 million. Still a great outcome, just nowhere near as big as Duolingo. And the examples go on. So let's talk about Apple. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak founded Apple back in the Stone Ages of 1976, right? On the idea that you could take these computers, which used to fill rooms back then, and turn them into something that was simple enough and easy to use that anybody could use it and make it a regular part of your life, right? But the other thing that was unique about their business was that it was a single platform. They made the hardware and they made the software, right? And by doing so, they could make the entire process much more integrated, much more efficient, and frankly, a better experience. Now, they also borrowed a lot of ideas from Xerox, but a big part of the efficiency and the seamlessness to make that system work on a consumer level was because they didn't have to worry about compatibility between Dell and IBM and Gateway. They made the hardware, they made the software, and they knew it would work, right? Now, they eventually lost that battle. But it was the calling card, the differentiator for Apple for many years. And of course, that resulted in Steve Jobs getting fired in 1985. And you fast forward, and here Apple actually went through two very important strategic pivots, right? So they rehired Steve back in 1996. They were practically bankrupt at that point. They were very, very close to bankruptcy. And what Steve did was he brought in this new concept of a mobile hub strategy, where the computer is the hub and all the tertiary products, which included eventually the iPhone, the iPad, the iPod, iTunes, were all products that integrated with that hub, which was your PC. Really, the turning point, if you study Apple, was when they introduced the iPod in 2001. Most people like to talk about the introduction of the iPhone, and obviously from a revenue perspective, the iPhone is perhaps the greatest product ever made. But the turnaround started before that with the iPod. And as a matter of fact, subsequent versions of the iPod looked a lot like an iPhone, and then they added the cellular capability to it. Again, it's a combination of product and business model. Now, it also doesn't have to all be technology, right? So let's think about IKEA. So IKEA is a leader in the furniture business, right? What you may or may not know is that IKEA is actually quite an old company. It was founded in Sweden in 1926 and did very specific types of furniture. They really started to transform their business, though, back in 1980, when they switched to this new business model that combined a reasonably high quality product with self-assembly and an entirely new distribution model, right? So the channel and how they introduced their product to the consumers changed completely. Their cost to deliver that product, their cost to manufacture that product changed dramatically as well. And essentially that was because of a business model change where they said, we are going to outsource assembly of this product to the consumer. No technology at all there, really more of a business model innovation. So it doesn't all have to be tech. And I hope I've made my case now that business models are important. I could go on and on with examples, but we'll stop there and start to get to how we implement this. So I didn't mention this when I gave my introduction, but I not only teach entrepreneurship here at Carnegie Mellon, but I'm an alumni of Tepper. I came here for my MBA back in the mid-90s. I came here specifically for the entrepreneurship program. Back in that day, Carnegie Mellon was one of only a handful of major universities that offered an entrepreneurship program. In fact, we were the first. And my professors at the time were Jack Thorne, who started the entrepreneurship program here, and a good friend of his who became a good friend of mine and is a great friend to the school and the Swartz Center is Don Jones, who has since passed away. Fantastic entrepreneur. He became a great mentor to me. And he used to tell me all the time, and he called me Bill. Some of you call me Will. But he said, Bill, don't make business more complicated than it needs to be. And so many young entrepreneurs do that, right? So I am going to follow Don's advice today as I take you through the business model canvas and keep it simple, right? Keep it practical. So let's get started. This is the business model canvas. Some of you may have seen this before. Do not get scared by all the teeny little letters in there and all the fine print, because we're going to go into most of these in detail, and I'll blow them up for people with old eyes like mine. But I want to teach you how to use this. Now, number one, this is a tool. That's all it is, right? It's going to help you think through and evaluate a business opportunity. It will help you make sure that you don't forget things that are important. But it is much more than just checking the box that, yes, I've thought about channels. Yes, I've thought about key activities. Yeah, maybe I don't have a partner, or maybe I do. That, if that's all you use it for, that's probably useful. But it's 1/10 of the full value that you can get out of this if you use it in the way that I'm going to show you today. So the first thing I want you to kind of notice about this tool is that it's really two halves. The right side of this tool is all focused externally and on the customer, right? So what are the customer segments? What are the value propositions for each of those customer segments? How do they pay me? How do they find me? What are their expectations, right? Those are the kinds of things that are all focused on the right side of this tool. On the left side is really more internally focused. This is about, how do I deliver? How do I make sure that I can deliver the value that I think I can create for my customers? And how can I do it at a profitable level that allows me to sustain and grow the business, right? So the right is externally focused, the left is internally focused. And I want you to think about it that way. Now, what I'm going to teach you is a very specific order that I have found by doing this with a number of students, entrepreneurs, and CEOs of small companies. And I think this order works best in the use of this tool. It is not start on the right and move to the left, or start on the left and move to the right. You're going to see that I bounce around a little bit on this tool, but for very good reasons. So the first part that I'm going to talk to you about is the customer segmentation. If any of you know me, or if you take my class, or if we work together on your business, because in my EIR role, you're going to find that everything starts and ends with the customer. And this should be no different with this canvas, with this tool, right? So the first step is detail who your customer is. Now, there's a couple things I like to highlight here. And I say this, and I teach this tool in my class, and 80% of the time my students don't get it the first time I say it. Detail is important here, right? I want you to use this tool as an opportunity to define everything that you know, because, by the way, this tool will become your internal business plan. As a matter of fact, I'm showing this to you in a virtual slideshow, right? But in reality, this should be on your wall, life size, right? 9 feet wide and 6 feet high, and you can use actually 3M stickies to fill these things in, right? But define your customer segments. Very rarely does a customer have one, or a company have one customer. And even if you do have one customer, chances are it's not so homogeneous that you don't have segments within it. Those segments potentially enjoy different value propositions, different benefits than others, and it's important that you get deep enough into the detail here to identify and characterize what those are. So answer the questions, for whom am I creating value? And by the way, who's the most important customer? Chances are you may have more than one customer, but that doesn't mean they're all created equal, right? You're probably going to have one paying customer and another enabling customer. Or you may have a third-party customer that purchases a byproduct of your product or service. My startup, MedSage, that I sold to Philips, I sold to home healthcare companies, but by virtue of doing that, I generated a great deal of data, which I sold to manufacturers in the industry. I sold to investors in the industry, and that data product became another very important and very high margin revenue stream. Most businesses have something like that. So who's your most important customer, right? And segment it. Make sure that you've really defined the characteristics. And by the way, use numbers, right? How many of them are there? How big is the market? Where do you find them? What are the qualifying characteristics, right? You can put a lot of detail on this if you blow this up and use this to its maximum extent. Now, it's important for you to realize that as you go through this, this is not a one-time process. So the first time you fill out this tool, you may find that, well, I don't really know how many there are for this particular segment. Put your hypothesis up there and highlight it as a risk item that you need to investigate. And by the way, back to the low tech thing, when I'm doing this in person with a CEO, I have a green sticky, a yellow one, and a red one. Green means this is, I have no questions about this. I know this is correct. I'm putting it up. Yellow means that this is a hypothesis of mine, but I need to validate some of the assumptions that go into this. And red means there's a high risk item here I need to make be a focus of mine right away, right? And the goal, of course, is to eventually make the whole board green. You know, a business that's been around for 5-10 years, you're not going to have a lot of red and yellow on there. You probably will still have some because, you know, the market never stops changing, the business never stops evolving. But over time, it will become more and more understood, right? In the beginning, you may have a lot of yellow and red, and that's okay, right? So define your customer. Detail is really important in this first step. Second step, for each of those customers, you need to define the value proposition, the benefit that your customers, you're hoping that your customer will extract from your service, right? So I told you not to worry about the small print. I'm blowing up all the print, but this is what, right here is what is listed right here in the canvas. And by the way, you can go download this canvas from Google anytime you like. But the kind of questions you need to be thinking of is, you know, what value do I deliver by customer, not just macro, but for each segment? Which one of our customers' problems are we helping to solve? Do we need to bundle products? Are they different for different segments? Are there some customers that perhaps you know, we may be creating some conflicts, right? Maybe some disincentives, and we need to be aware of that and be able to balance that somehow. And, you know, characteristics, there's a lot of different characteristics based upon the job they're trying to do and the benefit, the specific benefit that you're trying to provide. But it's important, again, that detail is important and quantification is important here, right? So in the spirit of Don Jones, who's whispering in my ear right now, keep this simple, this is what it boils down to, right? Define the value proposition for each customer segment, make sure you quantify it, right? And value can really come down to one of three different things. Either you're making somebody money or saving it. I'm gonna put them both under money. You're saving somebody time, or you're creating value that is valuable in some other way, and most of the time that is a relationship. It could be strategic. If it can be monetized, then it's going to go under dollars. And by the way, time is dollars as well, right? Time is money. So in most cases, you can quantify the value proposition, and I can't stress enough how important it is to quantify it whenever possible. The more general you are, the more difficult it's going to be to validate or invalidate your assumptions. And we're going to get to that in a bit, but that's a big outcome of what you're doing here. So customer segments, detail is important. Value proposition, detail is important, right? Now we're going to skip down to this box, revenue streams. So let me ask the group, what do you guys think, what is revenue? When I say revenue, what do you think of that? What comes to mind?
Exchanging a good or service in return for a monetary value, such as revenue.
Okay, and that's a very good technical term for it. Anybody else want to take a shot?
I would just say the money coming in.
Money coming in? true as well. Anybody want to go up? Like, let's say I'll characterize those as 10,000 feet solution or definitions. Let's go to 50,000 feet. Generalize a little bit more. What is revenue really at almost a philosophical level?
Goods for a service?
All of those are true, but I would propose to you that revenue is how your customer rewards you for value that you provide, right? It's how they tell you that what you are providing to them actually is something that they value themselves, right? And it needs to be quantifiable, right? And so why is that important? Well, it's important because it is very specifically linked to the value proposition. That's why we take it third, right? So we define the customer, we define the value proposition, and now essentially what we're doing is defining how we expect the customer to reward us for that value, right? That's why we're jumping in this particular order, right? So revenue is our share of the value that we create, essentially. Every business I've ever done started with the back of the napkin. And I'm not kidding about that, right? Just trying to understand the numbers behind the business that I'm attacking, right? So I'm going to use an example here. Obviously, this is very conceptual, but hopefully you'll get my point. If I'm generating value for a customer, and let's just say that value is worth $100 to my customer. And that could be because I'm saving them time, or I'm generating revenue or new sales for them, or maybe I'm saving them $100. It could come in a lot of different forms. But the bottom line is it's worth $100 for him. If I'm generating $100 worth of value, is there anybody here who's willing to pay me $100 for that? Come on, I'm generating $100 of value. I can't believe everybody's not jumping at that deal. The fact is there's no incentive if I'm charging you the same amount of what it's worth, right? Which is why we have this concept called the goodness factor, right? People are lazy and there is a cost to changing what they're doing, right? It's called switching cost, right? And so what you're providing has to have enough value so that it actually costs less than the value I'm going to extract from it. Like, I'm not going to pay you $100 for something that's worth $100. However, if I want a goodness factor of 10, well, then I might be willing to pay you $10 for that, right? $10, $100 divided by 10. If the goodness factor is 3, then I might pay you $33. And that's generally the range that you see, is to incent a customer to change what they're doing. You have to have a significant benefit to them as compared to the price they're willing to pay you. And the range is generally a 3x to a 10x, right? Don used to say 3x. As software has grown and become more efficient, that the expectations, frankly, have gone up. So if you're doing a software product, it may well be 10x. If you're doing a hard goods product, it may be 3, or maybe a straight service product. 3 might be mildly acceptable. When I did MedSage, my goodness factor was a 5x because I increased their sales by 500%, right? So, that became an easy proposition for me to sell. And I actually got pretty good at selling it, even though I'd never had a single training class on how to be a salesman. I'd come in and say, what would you do if I told you I could increase your sales by 500%? Even I could sell that, right? So I like to have startup ideas that are easy to sell. And the way you do that is having a strong goodness factor. So as you're looking at a business idea and evaluating, is this something I want to do? You want to make sure that you have a goodness factor that makes this something that's easy to sell. And that, by the way, your share of that is still a big enough market to make it worth your while to go after, right? So in this example, if the value I'm giving the customer is $100 and I think I need a goodness factor of 10, then my share is $10. And if there's 10 million customers, then it's a $100 million market, right? Now, You may ask yourself, is a $100 million market big enough? Well, there are cases where $100 million market potential is a great opportunity, and there are others where that's just simply not enough. That depends upon the application. But what I want you to do is think about this in a quantifiable way, and this tool will help you do that, right? Because the most viable commodity that you have, that I have, that we all have, and in fact, you're sharing that commodity with me right now, and I with you, is time, right? You only have so much time, right? You want to work on a venture that's worth your time. And this is the first step in evaluating that. So one of my favorite movies is Jurassic Park. And this is Jeffrey Goldblum from that movie. He's a proud Pittsburgh boy. Occasionally comes to Pirate games. But he also gave what I think is my favorite quote from this movie. When he was asked why he was not in favor of what they were doing, he said, because your scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could, that they didn't stop to think about whether they should, right? So this is your first opportunity to stop and say, should I do this? Should I invest my time in this? And it starts with defining the value proposition and then defining what you think your share of that value proposition is, which is under the revenue stream section of the business model canvas. Now, here's all the detail that's shown on the canvas. And you can go through and ask yourself, what value are our customers willing to pay? What are they currently paying for competitive alternatives? By the way, goodness factor is always, always, always compared to the competitive alternative. It's not done in a vacuum. You have to compare it to what their alternatives are, and there are always alternatives. And there's lots of types of pricing that could come out of this, right? You could sell it as an asset. You could charge a subscription fee. You could do dynamic pricing or fixed pricing. And all of the detail is here on the business model canvas. And now I'm going to throw you a loop. I've told you that detail is important. And here I'm going to tell you not to worry about the detail. Don't worry about the detail at this section, right? Because what I want you to verify is there enough value, and can I sell it at a reasonable goodness factor to make it easy enough to sell and still have it be enough money left over for me to go forward? I'm not going to get hung up in the details of whether I'm going to use dynamic pricing or fixed pricing or sell it as a subscription or charge a transaction fee or maybe even get advertising revenue, right? All of those things are relevant questions to ask. But for the first pass, I'm not trying to answer those questions. I'm trying to answer, is there enough left over for me? Now, there's a good reason why I say this. And the reason is, if you try to answer those questions, you will be wrong. That sounds like an overgeneralization, but it's basically true, right? The first time you go through a pass on a business model canvas, you will not have enough information to get close enough to know exactly how you're going to price it. Every startup I've ever done went through multiple pricing models before it really solidified in the version that I stuck with and grew and scaled the business at. And so I don't want you to get hung up on pricing at the early stages, but do get hung up on, is there enough money here for all of us to grow a business with, right? Because that's the question you're trying to answer. So far, and how am I doing time? Let's do a quick time check. Yikes. Okay. So far, we've gone through 3 boxes on this canvas. There's 9, right? So it's 113. You may say, how's he ever going to get this done? But you're going to see that I spend more time on these first 3 because they are by far the most important. If you don't get your thinking straight on these first 3, you are wasting your time worrying about the other 6. So start with customer, value, and revenue. Now, what do we know just from these first 3? First off, we know our customers, hopefully in good detail, right? We know what benefit we hypothesize they're going to derive from our service. And we also know whether there's enough money left over for us. But there's one other thing that we know, and it's a really important thing that most people miss. Does anybody have a guess what it is? No guesses? All right, I'll tell you since this is virtual. If we were in person, I wouldn't let you get away with this. But it's a really important one, right? And what it is we know what we don't know, right? Really important part of this tool. This is a collaborative tool that helps you and your team map out your business model, right? As you go through this, I've already said, you're gonna have sections that you're gonna have to color yellow or maybe even red if they're really high risk. It's going to make it obvious to you and to the entire team what you know and what you don't know. And that's probably as valuable as the other three put together, right? Because, by the way, those are the items you're going to spend the time on, right? As you go through customer discovery, as you put together a MVP or test a business idea, those are the things you're going to focus on. You're going to focus on your risk items because the success of any new venture is really a function of risk mitigation and risk management. So it's important that you use it in that way. Now, I'm going to go through the next 6 boxes a whole lot faster than I went through the first 3. But I want to spend a minute just on the last 2 on the customer side because people confuse them all the time, right? So customer relationships. Customer relationships is where you document what your customer expects from you when they buy your product and while they're using your product, and maybe even after they're using your product, right? Are you going to need to have a dedicated customer service team, or is this 100% self-service? Do you have to have account managers? As it turned out, we had to have for MedSage, right? I didn't realize that in the beginning. I was lucky that I had enough margin that I was able to fund that process because it became a really important part of our service. So thinking through what your customer expects from you in your relationship with them is really key. And believe me, you'll have unknowns in this process as well. The second box is customer channels. Distinctly different with one possible overlap, right? So what you're defining here is, how does my customer know we exist? How do they become aware of my service? How do they figure out if they're the right fit for it? Or how do I help them figure that out? How do they buy it if they decide they want it? If they buy it, how do I deliver it? You need to define all of that and think it through. And then how do I support it? And how do I support it? The after sales part is where it overlaps with customer relationships. And this is why these 2 sections so often get confused by new entrepreneurs and students or anybody really that hasn't used this tool before. They're distinctly different with one very small overlap, which is the after sales section. Now we move to the left side. This is, again, focused on, how do I deliver, right? So what are the key activities? Do I need to have a production? Do I need to have a factory? Do I need to have a warehouse? Do I need to have, a cadre of brilliant machine learning engineers, right? Because I'm going to do software development, right? So what are the key activities that I need to be strategically good at? And then how do I deliver it? What are the resources do I need, right? And by the way, hopefully I don't do everything myself. So hopefully there's some partners, and really challenge who the right partners are. Hopefully you have a plan A and a plan B, maybe even a plan C for partners, but what's their incentive and what's your incentive for working together? Almost every business has one partner or another, right? So think about what those are. And then lastly, after you've thought about how do I deliver, what resources do I need, what can my partners bring to the party, I have to figure out what's it going to cost. What's it going to cost for me to deliver this, right? And this is where we get back to the back of the napkin type of example, right? So if you remember in my example earlier, when we were doing revenue streams, we had a value proposition of $100, a goodness factor of 10. So my share of the revenue was $10. So now we start with 10. That's my revenue, right? And I have to be able to deliver that product at a profit level that makes it worth my while to go after, right? So now, in an example, you could have a direct cost of $3, which would allow you a margin of $7. If you have 10 million customers, that means there's $70 million potential, not actually revenue, market potential. And it has to be big enough, there has to be enough of that to cover your investment and your overhead and your fixed costs, right? And this again is a good example of, back to Jeffrey Goldblum, is this something that I should do, right? And if it isn't, then I have to go back and reevaluate, maybe I pivot, but all of that has to come in line, right? So there's a couple really key decision points as you go through this, specifically when you're defining, is there enough value and can I extract and monetize enough of that value? And then can I deliver it at a cost that can create a sustainable business? Now, there's a whole lot of assumptions that go through in order to get to that. And that's what this tool helps you discover, right? And uncover, right? So, in the end, the business model canvas becomes your internal business plan. So what do I mean by that? Back in the day, back in the Stone Ages, when I was a student here, we would analyze a new business idea and write a 50-page business plan and give it out to investors and hope somebody invested in us, right? And by the way, that business plan would change 3 times before we ever gave it out, and that would be if we were lucky. And so it was a very laborious tool to use to keep it up to date, right? This is a business plan for just my team and myself. It's on the wall. Everybody sees it when they walk in, and we can use it to understand where we should be focusing our time. Make it as specific and quantifiable as possible, especially when it comes to customer and value, and do it in the order that I specifically presented, because it's got to start with the customer and go to value and then revenue, and then start talking about how can I deliver this and what are the expectations, right? The order is actually important, and it's not just left to right or haphazard. It's very specific in that order. And then use it as a risk prioritization tool so that you can actually manage your day-to-day focus on your highest risk item and mitigate those risks, lower those risks as you go forward. And by the way, that's how you're going to increase the value of your company. It's not a one-time task. It's an evolutionary tool. Keep it visible to everybody. So it is now 1:22, and I know we're going to run out of time. So I wanted to do that last part quickly. Any questions anybody has or comments they want to make?
I have a question regarding presenting business model canvas to VCs. So you mentioned that previously you had to write a 50-page business plan and present it to VCs. And I also have heard that from the time that you start approaching VCs to finally get funding, it can take like 9 to 12 months. So I've never been into this process, but I wonder, like, how does it work with the business model canvas? Are you like showing this to the VCs? Is it like a formal way? Is it informal? Can you give some examples? And
yeah, so great question. I'm glad you asked that, because it helps me highlight a point that I thought I had made and I need to make stronger. And that is that the short answer is you don't. This is not a tool for you to talk to VCs with. This is your internal business plan. Your external business plan is essentially, at the top level, 3 things. It's your elevator pitch, it's your slide deck and presentation, by the way, slide deck and presentation, they're not separable, and the executive summary. That's what you use with the outside world. Now, let's say you use those, you do a pitch to a VC and they go, I'm interested, I want to do some due diligence before I make my investment. Most likely they'll come into your office and you may spend some time standing in front of that business model canvas talking through your assumptions, your questions, and your risks. And at a due diligence level, it's perfectly fine. But it is not something I would put in an investor pitch, and it's not something that I would use to explain my business, right? Because it's way too detailed. It's really for your team. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, sure. So basically, like approaching VCs, the most important part is the elevator pitch and the slide deck. And is it like the decision is made like instantly? Does the VCs like do the decision whether they tell you or not at the moment, or is it a process that takes a couple of like iterative rounds?
Yeah, another interesting question. So the answer is if they decide not to invest, it's practically an instantaneous decision, right? They're going to make a decision within the first 5 minutes, most likely, whether they're interested or not. And so it's, I'm not interested. This is, I don't want to invest, right? That's number one, within 5 minutes. Then there's a phase where they go, I'd like to learn more, right? That's where they're educating themselves and convincing themselves whether they want to invest or not. And then there's the actual decision to invest. And that's the part that can take months, right? It used to be back in the go-go days of the late 90s, that process was compressed dramatically. That's just not the way it is today, right? So that process can take, 6 months, sometimes even more, especially in today's environment.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Just last question.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed someone asked in the messages about if there is a template for this. I also want to ask, like, is there any do you know of any digital way of representation rather than because these days people are working remotely? I wonder if you don't want to put it in your office and work with your colleagues remotely.
Yeah.
Is there a good way of working on that remotely?
Yes. So yeah, good question. You can go, and there's multiple versions of this tool online. You can go download this tool from Strategizer, which is what I use today because I like all the detail that's in that. But they're not the only source. Google Business Model Canvas, and there's a million different copies of this that you can download from that perspective. You can't, most of the time what I tell the teams that I work with is that you don't have to keep it in that form if you're doing it digitally. A lot of times it ends up being, a Word document or something like that with the details under each section. I don't know if there's any kind of digital, more graphic forms of it out there. There may be. I'm not sure that that's all that viable, really, frankly, because what you really want to do is just make sure that you make this visible to everybody and that you go into a sufficient detail, especially in the customer and the value section. And you highlight the risks and you highlight the unknowns.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Hi, myself, Ramesh. So I see, so someone asked the Trello one. The Trello, I see a business model canvas template is there, so you can use it in Trello. I see that before. So I want to ask the question, right? Model canvas templates, we can find plenty of them in Google, but I want something, a formal business plan where I can present to investors. Do you have some kind of template for that?
So I think there's probably a Connect session on exactly this. Allison, you might correct me if I'm incorrect there, but I teach a general format for investor pitches. It has 10 different sections to it. That's a topic all by itself. There are some very important techniques in putting together a good investor pitch. To say it's a template is probably wrong, only because investor pitches are not all created equal, right? Depending upon the business, depending upon where the risks are in that business, you may move some of the sections of that presentation around. For instance, when I talk about SovaSage, I talk about the team right up front. Why? Because it's in a business in a market that I've been in for 35 years now and built a company and sold to Philips in, right? So I want to highlight the fact that we've got a team that knows this market, right? Many times a new venture team wouldn't start out with the team right at the beginning. It depends upon the circumstance and what you want to emphasize first. But they all have basically all the same basic elements, right? What is the customer? What's the pain point? How are you going to monetize it? What are the barriers to entry? There's specific questions that you want to answer in any investor pitch. And generally, and this is something that Don Jones beat into my head, is you got to keep it simple, right? It needs to be 10 slides or less. You can have 50 backup slides, but your main investor pitch needs to be very short. Allison, do we have a Connect session on just good practices for pitching?
Yeah, we have Jim Jen coming up in November for investor pitching.
Does that answer your question, Ramesh?
Yes. One more question. So do you think that competitors can be part of model canvas? I see that different segments out there. The competitors part is not in the canvas.
So obviously
Can you
understanding
add
the
that?
Yeah, so understanding the competitive environment is really important, but I tend to hold them out separate. Now, that said, when you're looking at value proposition, when you're thinking about goodness factor, it has to be in the context of what's the competitive environment and what are their competitive alternatives, right? So you need to be able to answer, who are the competitors and what do I think they're doing? What's their competitive reaction to this? Or perhaps what are they doing that could preempt what I'm doing, right? But this is my business model, not theirs, right? So it needs to be done in the context of that environment, but with that context in mind.
All right.
Any other questions? There's messages. I don't know if there's any on here or not. Trello? I don't know. I don't know Trello. It looks like maybe it does. They may have a link.
Yeah, Trello is a kind of Kanban tool that gives the task board. They have the template, Canvas template. They can readily use it, like a task board, which you show us. The same thing, you can see it in the Trello software tool.
It's all about what you're comfortable with, right? As long as you are doing the analysis that I described, I'm less concerned about the presentation and more concerned about the substance.
I agree, yeah.
All right, well, we are at 1:32, so I think we're out of time, Allison, correct?
Yeah. So thank you everybody for attending.